This is the third video on definitions of abnormality, and it's number 3, failure to function adequately. So this definition of abnormality identifies that people might not be coping with their everyday life and with their everyday tasks. And when there's a failure to cope with things like with life, basically, so things like they might not be maintaining their hygiene, so they might smell, they might not be attending college or work, they might have trouble maintaining healthy relationships, so they might be completely withdrawn and end up losing friends because they're not engaging with people, or they might not cope in a different way with their friendships or relationships. They might just be like really over the top and kind of scare people off, but it's kind of not being able to read the signs of other people. It might be that people can't actually leave the house or have huge difficulty like just going to the shops and perhaps like making an evening meal or something like that. They might also spend time crying or asleep or be completely out of touch with reality. And society recognises this behaviour and defines it as abnormal. So failure to function adequately in terms of not coping with work might indicate a mental health illness such as anxiety or depression. And it's the idea that when someone isn't coping, that it could be there's a mental health disorder behind that reason that they can't cope. Another thing to say about the failure to function definition is that the person who is unwell or not coping often feels extreme distress, and so they are really if they're feeling upset and distressed at their inability to cope, and that kind of exacerbates it. But the other thing is that the person themselves will feel distressed, but also other people around them feel distressed in their company. So that's another feature of the definition. There's a picture on the screen of Michael Jackson, the late Michael Jackson, and this was from when he thought he kind of must have lost touch with reality, really, because he thought it'd be a really good idea to dangle his baby over a balcony of a hotel to show the press his baby. And obviously when he had the thought to do that, he didn't realise how distressing that would be. So you can see the distress on his face, and all of the press who were below the balcony were completely distressed as well. So it's just that he had kind of lost touch with what was normal, what was acceptable, what would be a good thing to do. And so that could indicate a mental health disorder. So we're going to look at some strengths and limitations, and the first one is a limitation of this definition, and it's saying, well, who judges? Who decides whether someone is failing to function adequately? It could be the person themselves who is experiencing distress, like not being able to get to work or manage everyday life, but it could be that the individual is quite content with the situation and or unaware that they are not coping. Sometimes people with schizophrenia won't know that they're not coping, and so the judgment is more about the feelings of distress in others. Another criticism of this definition is that behaviour may not be dysfunctional. So dysfunctional behaviour is often seen as abnormal and maladaptive, but actually what we're saying is perhaps it could be adaptive for the individual. So if you look at the top right hand picture, you can see there's a boy crying, and that is he's not coping with whatever situation he's in, and he's broken down and he's crying. And so that is kind of, according to failure to function, he is not coping and he's crying, and it's causing distress in other people and himself. But actually that behaviour is adaptive for that individual. So some mental health disorders like depression cause people to cry, and that can lead to welcome extra attention for the individual. And so actually that behaviour is adaptive. And the same with eating disorders. So it becomes very apparent when someone has an eating disorder, because although they try to hide it, their extreme weight loss is a clear indication that they need help and support. The other thing to say is that I find this hard to say because I don't want to label anybody as abnormal, but in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health, then people who are transvestites, that behaviour is included in mental disorders. But we can heavily criticise that because it's not dysfunctional, nor an indication of not coping for many people. And so you only have to watch like RuPaul's Drag Race to see how absolutely fabulous the people are who go on that program, and how many of them make an incredible living and love what they're doing. And so actually they are coping. So this definition is saying, oh, they're not coping with life, but actually they are coping. And not only that, they've flipped it on its head and they're living their best life. So that is a really strong criticism of the theory. However, there is a strength of the definition of failure to function adequately, because it combines subjective experiences and quantitative measures in order to define mental ill health. So in one of the previous definitions called statistical infrequency, a problem with that is that it just says if your behaviour is rare, then you are abnormal, you've got mental health disorder. Whereas the failure to function adequately asks people, you know, they want to find out, are you coping? They'll have a conversation. And so that's so important to include them in that kind of diagnosis. So that's really important. But alongside those subjective measures, you also have objective measures as well. So there's a quantitative scale. So there's a questionnaire called the World Health Organization Disability Assessment, and when people do the questionnaire, it will give them a score out of 180, and the criteria on it are actually measuring about whether people are functioning in society or not, or whether they're not coping. So it measures a person's understanding and communicating, getting around, self-care, getting on with people, life activities, and participation in society. And when they answer, they get a score for each question between 1 and 5, which gives them an overall score out of 180. And so combined with their subjective experience, that gives medical professionals and the person themselves a really good indication of whether they are coping and whether they need extra support or help. And so they therefore might recognise a mental disorder behind their not being able to cope. And also, if you think about it, if someone does the questionnaire and isn't coping, and then gets help, and then does the questionnaire again, they themselves are going to have that quantitative measure to show your mental health has improved and you are coping with life much better now. And on the flip side of that, then perhaps they might do it and their score has got worse, and they realise actually that they're not coping as well as they used to. So it's just a really good thing to have like both subjective and objective measures in order to define the abnormality. I recommend you do the revision and directed study, because that will consolidate your knowledge. And I've put here to do a timed essay, and you should allow around 20 minutes in the exam to do a timed essay. And if you get a 16 marker with a stimulus, then you have to make sure that you structure it correctly. So let's just take a very quick look at this timed essay. It says, Imani was worried about her friend Molly and decided to tell her tutor what was going on. So Imani says, she hardly ever comes to lessons, and when she does, she smells really strongly, and it's so awkward because everyone knows it's her. All her other friends have given up on her, as she hardly ever replies to messages and doesn't turn up to parties. I feel like I'm her only friend. Outline and evaluate the failure to function adequately explanation of abnormality. Refer to Imani's concerns in your answer. So 16 marks, the structure. Don't be tempted to just whoosh straight in and start going, oh, I can see Molly's not coping with college, she's not coping with hygiene. You need to outline the theory first. It says outline and evaluate. So description, outline the failure to function adequately explanation for 6 marks. Then you go into talking about Molly and Imani. And so it's 4 marks for AO2, and so therefore you should have like 2 application paragraphs really to explain whether Molly is coping and how that links to the FFA explanation. Then when you've done that, you should really aim to do 3 evaluation points, because roughly you get 2 marks per evaluation. And make sure you identify, and if you do 2, just do them in more detail, but get a strength and a limitation in, and that should cover it. And those are your picture references.